I just wanted to take one quick moment to acknowledge what's happening in the Middle East and extend our thoughts and prayers to everyone over there that are going through some pretty tough times right now, and how fortunate we are to be where we are. But our thoughts are with them. So I don't want to not say it because we're going to get off to a bunch of things that are very interesting and I think fun tonight, but just acknowledging where we are in the world. So our thoughts and prayers to them. So we're getting this event going. We do an event every year, one in the spring, one in the fall. In the springs, usually, we always say Lexington's about connecting the head and the heart. As you look up here, you see a bunch of words. And they're not just words that we threw on a tablet. We sat down, all of our advisors, and we said, when we think about what we do for a living and what our vocation and avocation is, what are the words that we think of when we think about how we work with each other, how we work with our clients, and so on and so forth. So each of these words came from our team. The big one in the middle is connecting, and I know we're talking about artificial intelligence tonight, but I think there is some room in this world for personal connection and to have empathy and to really understand where people are coming from. And without connection and empathy, I think your skill set doesn't matter so much, because if you don't care, what is it? So these words do mean something to us. When we were putting together the event tonight, we had heard Dana Farby speak at a Hightower event, and we were really, really impressed with her, and it was a subject that we didn't know much about. So we asked her to join us tonight, and she came in from Pennsylvania, so we're very thankful for that. And at one point, I was supposed to do a fireside chat with her, but what I know about AI, I could write on the back of my hand. So a friend of mine from an entrepreneurs group I'm in, who's a tech entrepreneur who's done a lot of this, is going to be doing a fireside chat with her. And then we're going to get into the really sexy, interesting stuff, investments. And the head of the research firm that we work with, which is an international firm, is sitting here, and he will present, and I'll do a fireside chat with him. For those of you that don't know Lexington or haven't seen us lately, that's our team. We're about 20 to 30 people, depending on how we count full-time equivalencies. We advise on about $2.2 billion, and we're a little humbled by that. Christine and I co-founded Lexington about 22 years ago, and we had no millions under advisement. So we had no clients, and we were just walking up and down the street looking for people to become clients. So we're proud of that. We have about 800 clients with us to date. And then we grew the firm, and we got to about $1 billion in 2018, 2019. And we were noting a lot of firms like ours really hadn't figured out how to grow the firm so the firm could be around 10, 20, 30 years hence for our clients. So we went to market, and we looked at several different suitors that we thought could help us scale our firm and could take some things off our plate that we didn't love doing. So in 2019, we joined with a firm called Hightower, and the CEO of Hightower was a senior executive at Fidelity, Bob Burrows, who lived in Lexington, Mass, and we had known him for a number of years. And he was just going there to become the CEO of that company. And he did a pretty good sell job on Chris and I, because he convinced us that we should join forces with them, and that they would more or less leave us alone day to day, but help us where we could use help and provide services for our clients. And they kind of held true on their promise. So they now have about $130, $140 billion that they advise on in aggregate, and they own a number of firms like ours around the country, I think 130 or 140. And we're in the top 25 firms that they own around the country. So they like us, they give us a lot of love and care and respect, and really help bring resources to us. So if you haven't seen us lately, there's a bunch of things that you guys know we do. We meet with you, we do financial planning, we do investments and the like. We rebalance. We're very conscious about tax and after-tax returns and all of that. But as time's gone on, we've expanded our scope of services we can bring. So we have a number of things for those of you or friends or colleagues that are entrepreneurs that we can do to help them out. On the entrepreneurial front, we can go out and provide a Zillow kind of valuation of your business, which can be used in estate planning, divorce planning, and the like. We also have consultants we work with that can help with the M&A piece of it, which is a referral that we'll make out to them. We can also help with real estate, commercial real estate, and we can help seek out loans and help out things in that area. We also have an estate planning group on retainer, so you may have your estate plans drawn up, but if you're looking for independent review of your estate plans, we can definitely do that for you and come back. Not saying it's right or wrong, but just give you some additional bullets of things to think about. So we've brought a lot more services to bear on your behalf. And the good news is it doesn't drive up your costs at all. You know, what you're paying us is what you're paying us. So we just want to be able to provide more services to our existing clients and to help some of those that maybe had some needs that we weren't working with in the past. So enough on us. So Dana Falvey, she's going to speak. She's headed up innovation and technology at InvestNet, and all of you should know this company because if you're a client of ours, your performance reporting is done on something called Tamarack, which her company owns. She heads it up there, and she was with TD before that, and headed up an innovative program for them. And she's done many great things. She's a wonderful speaker, very dynamic, and I'll turn it over to Dana.
Thank you. That's okay. Hello. Yep, I need that.
Getting you there.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's Danny Fava. Fava like the bean. That's okay.
Thank you.
I am the group head of innovation for a company called InvestNet. We are a publicly traded company, and we create technology for financial advisory firms. What I do at the company, I do not have an engineering background. I'm not a technologist. I'm a business leader, and I figure out how to use technology to meet business needs. In the last year or so, what I've been doing with InvestNet is leading their generative AI efforts. And I think that qualifies me to talk about this, although there is a real expert sitting over here, John Radoff, who I'm going to speak with next in front of you all. So he's going to grade me on this presentation. I am nervous. So let's start real simple. Make sure this clicker works. Okay, what is AI? I'm sure you've all heard of artificial intelligence. What is it? When was it developed? What does it do? It is a branch of computer science, and it's basically teaching computers, or it's not teaching computers actually. It's a way for computers to learn and make decisions in the same way a human brain does. That sounds a little bit frightening, but it's really not that scary yet. So let me give you an example of AI and how I explain it to the common person. You've learned throughout the course of your life when it's probably going to rain. You walk outside in the morning and you say, I think it's going to rain today. I'm going to go back in. I'm going to grab an umbrella. How did you make that decision? You weren't programmed to make that decision. Nobody ever sat you down and said, this is what a rainy day feels like. This is what it looks like. Look out for these things. You learned what a rainy day felt like based on experience. You learned based on the hundreds of times you've walked out of your house before and the air feels a certain way. The sky's kind of gray. It's got sort of a smell in the air, and you know it's about to rain. That's experiential learning. That is basically the way artificial intelligence works. It is not an algorithm. It is not programmed. It does not follow a set of rules. Instead, it learns from inputs. So, to build the machine, we feed it thousands of sunny days, and we say, these are sunny days. We feed it thousands of rainy days, and we say, these are rainy days. And it goes and finds its own pattern to then identify with a really high degree of certainty with what that next day is. You give it that next day and you say, okay, computer, what kind of day is this? And it will tell you it's a rainy day and be right in a high degree and high probability. That's what artificial intelligence is. So artificial intelligence was actually developed, the concept, in the 50s. There was a man, his name is Alan Turing. Have you ever heard of the Turing test? Some people here have. What the Turing test was he created a way to decide, is this computer as smart as a human? Can you interact with the computer, and can you, a human, differentiate whether or not you're talking to a computer or you're talking to a human? That test was developed in the 50s, and the concept of artificial intelligence was developed at the same time. But there were a lot of problems back then with the tech, right? Could we actually create AI? And then there was a big, long AI winter that basically nothing happened. Why? Because the internet didn't exist. We didn't have access to all of the data we have access to today, and we didn't have the processing power, right? You all know you have more processing power in your cell phone than NASA had when they sent a spaceship to the moon. So now we've hit a couple of tipping points with artificial intelligence. We can do it now. One of the biggest tipping points was in 2017 when AI defeated the world's #1 AlphaGo player. Do you all remember that? It's like a big moment in artificial intelligence where it sat down against a master and it beat him. And that was the moment where we were like, oh, artificial intelligence is back. And now that machine, and it's moving quickly, by the way. The advancements in artificial intelligence are moving really quickly. That AI, that artificial intelligence that beat the AlphaGo champion, is now known as weak or narrow AI. Why? Because even though that AI was so great at Go, it couldn't do anything else. Literally, couldn't do anything else. It could just do that one thing. And that is now known as weak AI or narrow AI. And we're moving quickly away from that into deeper forms of AI. The way you've experienced these kind of artificial intelligence is you're actually using a lot of artificial intelligence on your day-to-day lives. You've seen it inside of your virtual assistants when you talk to Siri, and Siri understands what you're saying and is able to give you an answer. If you've ever used any kind of language translation or facial recognition, these are all forms of AI. So you are interacting with AI in your day-to-day lives. But you've all seen some movies, right? Where AI comes and takes over the world. It's so smart, it outsmarts humans, it figures out, hey, I know what's wrong with the world, you're wrong with the world, right? We've all seen those movies. So the question is it time to be scared yet? And where are we on the path to self-aware machines, right? Because those are the machines in the movies that kind of like take over the world. They become self-aware, they kill humanity. We're not close to that yet. So here's the whole long path of AI. We had the reactive AI. We've got limited memory AI, where now limited memory AI is kind of like, we're a little bit beyond that. What limited memory AI is I can remember something that happened before. And that's used in self-driving cars. So I find this one really interesting as a distinction. If you think about AI playing chess, okay? AI is making a decision based on what the chessboard looks like right now. It's looking at the pieces and it's making a decision based on what it looks like right now. But in a self-driving car that's using artificial intelligence, it actually needs to remember what happened moments ago. Because you, as a human, when you're driving and you see a car coming at 90 miles an hour and it's about to cross the corner that you're about to turn on, you make a very quick processing decision with your human brain that says, I know that car was going 90 miles an hour a moment ago and I shouldn't go, right? That's limited memory AI. Limited memory AI knows what was happening moments ago, and that is very, very important to its ability to succeed. The next step along this long path of AI, and this is where I say we are. I have a little robot guy that says we're right there. You kind of agree with that, John? You can tell us later. The next part of AI becomes theory of mind and then self-aware. So we've got a long way to go before we really have to be terrified of this AI coming to get us. And I don't know if it will happen in our lifetime. We'll hold on to that question for when John gets on stage. But the reason why it's moving very quickly is because it's really efficient right now. And the reason why it's really efficient is because we've got something called generative AI. And generative AI is AI that can actually produce a useful output for you. It can produce text, it can produce code for engineers, it can produce images. And this is all of a sudden, so many companies want to invest in AI. Why? Because it's going to increase productivity and throughput and customer satisfaction and all of those things. So much so that 72% of companies plan to increase their AI investments every year over the next 3 years. So we are not going to see AI slow down, in my opinion. I actually think we're going to see it become more ubiquitous. And the very ubiquitous example is, how many of you in here have used ChatGPT? Show of hands. A lot of you. What is ChatGPT? ChatGPT is the other tipping point, right? This is the most recent tipping point, in my opinion, where generative AI was now exposed to consumers. Now we can all use generative AI on our phones, on our computers, wherever. I have stopped using Google search. I do not use Google search anymore. I strictly use generative AI through either ChatGPT or another one called Perplexity. I use generative AI for everything I want to know or do. Okay, I don't use Google search anymore. That's obsolete to me. What is ChatGPT like? What do I use it for? And how many other people use it? Well, let's talk about its adoption. ChatGPT had the fastest adoption we've ever seen from any technology ever, including TikTok. How many of you use TikTok? No one? How many of you watch TikToks? More people. So this is how long it took for each one of these technologies to reach 100 million users. Mobile phones, 16 years. Yeah, they were expensive. TikTok, 9 months. That's very fast. Any guesses on how long it took ChatGPT to reach 100 million users?
A week.
A week. That's really fast. It took 2 weeks. You were off by 1 week. So here's an example of what I use ChatGPT for. You can't really see what I'm typing, and this is a video, but I'll read it to you, or I'll tell you what I asked ChatGPT for, and it'll give you a sense of how ChatGPT and generative AI is changing the world we live in today. I asked ChatGPT to create a meal plan for me. I said, hey, can you please create me a 7-day meal plan? By the way, I want 140 grams of protein, 140 grams of carbs. I would like 80 grams of fat. I don't eat red meat, and I'm gluten-free. Oh, and by the way, I also have a coconut allergy. It gave me a 7-day meal plan within 30 seconds, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack with no repeated meals. And that was free. And it's free to all of you to use that also. So I think the big question for kind of all of us becomes, how does this impact the decisions that I'm making? How does this impact the decisions my children, my grandchildren are making in terms of what professions they choose? And how do I change my own business, right? For business owners, this is a big deal. What's going to change? I think a lot of this changes. I think it changes the landscape for so many different professions. What I have here is a screenshot of all the different personas ChatGPT can take on, generative AI can take on. Actually, this is definitely not a screenshot of all the different personas ChatGPT can take on, because that can actually take on whatever persona you tell it to. You can tell ChatGPT to act like a teacher, act like a psychologist, act like a nutritionist, act like a fitness expert, a trainer. Right? So what does this mean for these professions? Well, I think it simply means that we have to focus on experiences. Everybody's profession, what you're sitting in right now, is an experience. It's an experience that's brought to you by your financial advisory firm, right? ChatGPT can't do this. Can't have you all sit here together and interact and talk. All of our jobs now have to focus on experiences. What can we bring that is uniquely human that artificial intelligence cannot? So I'm going to go to another topic. I felt like this topic was good for this audience. Can ChatGPT write me a paper? Yes. Can it write me an essay? Yes. Can it write me a blog, a social media post? Yes. It can write you everything. Or call it what?
Can it get you a 4.0 in that paper?
Yeah. Can it get you an A? A 4.0, right? A 4.0 GPA. Yeah. No doubt. You may have to actually make it sound not as smart as it sounds. There's a lot of questions around this now, right? Guess what? Every student that you know is using ChatGPT to write papers. Everyone. And this is the same problem we experienced when the search engines became available and the internet became available, because colleges and universities were really annoyed that we didn't have to go to the library anymore, right? So now they're faced with this other challenge. We can use ChatGPT to write most everything that we write, and actually it comes out with a great output. You should edit it. We'll talk more about that. I know this is like a random picture. Why is this on the screen? Here's the question. If you have ChatGPT write a paper for you, a blog, and you use it word for word, you copy it, are you infringing on someone else's copyright? It's like a big question. I see some people shaking their heads. Nope, no, you're not infringing on copyright. Do you guys know why? That's the right answer. You're not. Right now. I'm going to tell you a story. I love this story. It's about a gorilla. I'm an animal lover. This gorilla took that picture of themselves. It's a selfie. A photographer was out on an African safari, and this photographer noticed that the gorillas really liked the cameras. So what the photographer did was he left the cameras there overnight for a couple of days. He left them out in the forest. And when he came back to the cameras, he noticed that the gorillas had taken selfies. This is one of them, a real selfie taken by a gorilla. And guess what he did? He's like, this is the best picture I ever saw. I'm going to sell it to National Geographic. And he did. He sold it to National Geographic, and he won some awards, and he made some money. And he ran to the bank, and PETA said, hold on a second. Those aren't your pictures. You didn't take them. Who took them? That guy took them. The monkey. The gorilla took them. So PETA sued the photographer for copyright infringement. The PETA said, actually, those aren't yours, those are mine. I'm going to take that money on behalf of the gorilla, and I'm going to put that money back into the forest, right? So what the U.S. Copyright Office ruled, in this case, who knew this case was going to become this, we were going to be talking about this in artificial intelligence. What the U.S. Copyright Office ruled was that only a human has right to copy. Only a human has right to copy. So can a machine claim copyright? No. No, you are not infringing on anybody's copyright. What you could be doing, though, could be considered plagiarism. And this is more of an ethical, moral than it is a legal issue. So you could be committing plagiarism, and that is something that we have to be mindful of, because you cannot set forth something as your own that you authored it if you did not. So you must cite, in order to avoid plagiarism, where you got the information from. Makes sense? There's all these other questions about copyright and plagiarism around artificial intelligence, and we'll answer all of your questions when we have our fireside chat. I don't know why they call it fireside when there's no fire.
I'll get it right phone.
Okay. So let me skip through some of these. There is some advice I want to give you, and I'm going to tell you another story, okay? And then I'm going to kind of rush the rest of it so we can get to the talk. I want to hear from John. I know a bunch of financial advisors because of the work that I'm in. One of the financial advisors I know, his name is Rick Edelman. He's actually really famous because he's got a radio show. You know it? You guys ever hear of it? Here's what he did. I saw him at a conference not too long ago. We started talking about generative AI. He's always on the cutting edge of technology, and he told me what he did. He had ChatGPT write a whole radio show for him. He didn't stop there, though. He also had his voice synthesized by artificial intelligence. So he gave a synthesizer 3 minutes of his voice, and gave the synthesizer also the script of the radio show that ChatGPT wrote for him, and he recorded a 20-minute episode completely written by and completely recorded by his synthesized voice, all using artificial intelligence. And no one knew. He told me, Danny, not one person has picked up on it. I went and listened to the episode, and I'll tell you, I wouldn't have known either. Why is this really important for you guys to know? Because there's a lot happening with fraudsters, the bad guys, using artificial intelligence and voice synthesizing to steal, right? Because what we used to tell financial advisors, by the way, was don't take an email as an instruction to transfer money. Make sure you get a phone call to validate that you're talking to your client, right? Well, that's kind of out the window now because AI can synthesize your voice, and guess what? It only needs a few seconds of you speaking. So that's you picking up the phone and talking for a couple of seconds to somebody. Okay, they can get your voice. There's actually an easy way to solve this. And if I leave you with anything today, I want to leave you with this piece of advice, and I want you guys to all go home and do this if you haven't done it already. It's a really old school, easy way to protect yourself. Does your family have a secret word? Not banana, like that's everyone's secret word. Go home with your kids and your grandkids and pick a secret word. So easy. If you ever get a phone call from your grandchild who said they're in jail and need bail money, your son who said they want you to transfer money real quick because they were on vacation and they got stuck somewhere, just say this. What's the secret word? So easy. You know it. It's your family's favorite game. It's your childhood address. It's whatever, right? So easy. You can do it right now in a group text. But don't, because that would be rude. Such an easy fix to this problem. So does AI have a dark side? Kind of. But I'm going to tell you why. It's kind of because of us. So here's something sort of profound. The biggest problem with AI is that it's biased. And every AI engineer knows this. And why is AI so biased? And why are we kind of afraid of it? Well, because it learned from us, right? It learned using all of our data. It learned all of our biases. It learned all of our ways. And humans, we're great sometimes, but we're not great sometimes. So even the godfather of AI left Google to go start his own thing outside of the corporate world because he was scared that the technology would fall into the wrong hands and would be misused, and he thought more focus needed to be placed on doing the right thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about bias. I don't know how long I've got like 5 minutes left. Okay, I'm going to go quick through this. So here's like one or two stories that I really love to get the point across about why AI is biased and when we figured that out, because they're kind of fun stories. So a student was working on a project, and the project was to filters. Like she was trying to create basically TikTok filters, right? Where you look in the camera recognizes your face, and it makes you a lion. It makes you a dog, whatever. And she kept looking in the mirror, and she knew this technology worked, but she couldn't get the technology to pick up her face. After try after try after try, no face detected is what she kept seeing come back on the computer screen. Then she had a Halloween mask, like an actual Halloween mask, like Michael Myers. She put it on, looked in the mirror, and it turned her into a lion. Why? She was a black student. And the artificial intelligence did not recognize her face. Why? Because it's trained on data that we gave it, and we didn't give it enough people of color for it to pick up her face. That's bias built into the machine. And you can imagine any law enforcement, any identification system using facial recognition that we think is so great is biased and is not doing the right thing and not properly representing all humans. The second story of bias is actually I like even better. It's from Amazon. Amazon had this great idea. Amazon gets a lot of resumes, thousands upon thousands of resumes. People want to work for Amazon. It got tired of the redundant task of reading resumes. It says, let's build an AI machine that can bring in all these resumes and tell me who's a good prospect for employment. So how did Amazon train the machine? Amazon said, here are resumes of really good employees, right? Here are all my best employees that have the best marks and they're always doing the right thing and they've got great performance reports. I'm going to pull all their resumes and put them in the machine and the machine's going to learn, right? What's a good prospect? What does a good resume look like? Where's the flaw? Where's the flaw in that? The flaw is, how do you know they're good employees? Well, because some human gave them a good performance report. Well, okay, humans, who are you giving good performance reports to? The men. So Amazon learned how to pull out the resumes of the best prospective employees, and guess what? They were all male employees. The AI was broken. It was biased. Guess what they did to fix it? How would you fix it? They unplugged it, threw it away. They said, we can't fix that. It's an unfixable problem. The data's bad. Garbage in, garbage out. You ever hear that? So AI learns from all of our data. It learns from all of our bias. It inherits our bias. It has to. As a matter of fact, if it's not biased, guess what? It's not working. Because remember what I said at the very beginning of the presentation. AI is supposed to mirror the human brain. And our brains are biased. And therefore, the technology will be also. And if it's not working. Definitely a topic I want to talk more to John about. Maybe John's figured out how to fix it. We'll see. I kind of wanted to just touch on competitive advantage real quick because I know you guys are all invested in thinking about markets and money and who's going to win here. Like, I know you're all smart people and your brain kind of goes there. Big opportunity, who's going to win? There's tons of companies out there that are doing amazing things, amazing work. I would say there's big tech companies, though, also who have invested a ton of money in this data. Some of these companies are investors in OpenAI, who produces ChatGPT. I specifically love Microsoft and all of the work that they're doing because they're bringing AI to organizations. And actually, it's probably not confidential. I don't know. I trust you guys. But InvestNet, the company that I work for, is really partnering with Microsoft to build enterprise-grade artificial intelligence. So I think these companies, thankfully, invested in their future and are really using generative AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning to its fullest potential. I'm really bullish about the area and excited to see what comes next. So I'm going to leave it there so we can get John up on stage and Mike to interview us and hear all of your questions because I know you guys have a bunch and hope you enjoyed that talk.
You guys hear me? I thought that was fascinating, and I was really excited to hear Danny speak today. At the beginning, I was supposed to be the person doing this fireside chat, so I'm not, thank God. So here's an introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, before we jump into the fireside AI discussion, here, let's meet. I must confess a little secret. I've decided to delegate the fireside interview to someone else, and there's good reason for it. You see, my experience in AI is about as advanced as my smartphone's autocorrect. Always entertaining, but not quite reliable. So, without further ado, let me introduce our amazing interviewer who knows AI like the back of his digital hand. I didn't write that. ChatGPT did. So, I've only had it for a week. I was playing around with it, and that's what we came up with last night. So, quick intro on John. So, John and I are an entrepreneur CEO group together, and we have been for years. And John's always fascinating me. He's kind of like the most interesting man in the world, if you remember the Dos Equis commercial. He's climbing mountains, he's scuba diving, he took a company public, he's created all kinds of gaming programs that thousands of people around the world have played. A Star Trek game in particular. I'm a bit of a Star Trek nerd, so it always impressed me. And John speaks on this topic and a lot of other technology topics around the country. Matter of fact, he is speaking tomorrow over at MIT. So he comes into it from more of an engineering background. So I thought it would be a fascinating conversation listening to these two very bright people have a chat about this. And then we'll open up to all of you to ask questions or make comments. So, there you go, John.
Thanks, Mike. And it's actually millions of people use those games, not thousands, but
Okay.
but who's counting? All right.
At least you said your name.
There we go. So what do we want to talk about, Danny?
Well, my favorite topic around AI to really dig into is the bias. That does AI have a dark side? And should we be worried? What are you seeing out in the engineering space?
So I think there's a few things to appreciate about what's happening with AI. One is that these technologies are accelerating very, very fast. So like the example that you gave of the Amazon, it's like 5 years old before any of the what we call large language models. So ChatGPT is something called a large language model, an LLM. Large language models basically didn't even exist at that point in time. So they didn't have the ability to do a lot more complicated inference of language. Another famous example, though, is a Microsoft example. They created a chat bot that sat on Twitter and talked to people, and it was super amusing for a little bit until it started being like very racist in its comments. Because guess what? It learned to do that from what it observed on Twitter. So those things happen. The systems have gotten better at understanding whether they're doing things like racism within text, for example. Like if you go to ChatGPT, I'd invite you to play around with it and see how it reacts to anything you want to put in. It'll be able to detect it, almost certainly. And that's because there's a lot of what they call reinforcement learning with human feedback that's happened on top of ChatGPT. So ChatGPT uses a lot of data from the internet. You couldn't have made a ChatGPT or a large language model without the internet because it pulls in massive, massive quantities. Basically, it downloads the entire internet, looks at all that content, and it analyzes it to find out what people are talking about it, and that's how it trains the language model. But it turned out that wasn't enough to actually make ChatGPT work well. What they added to ChatGPT is an additional training process where panels of humans actually sit down and they test it, they provide inputs, they look at types of responses it gave, so that if, for example, you start seeing racist feedback out of the prompts that you put into ChatGPT, you could actually train it to say, you know what, that's not what we want to see in the output. Now, that does surface a different kind of bias, which is maybe there's a bias that's inherent in the type of people or the policies that you put forth to ask people to do the reinforcement learning with human feedback. So, for example, one of the critiques that has surfaced of ChatGPT, I see it more from conservative groups than anything else. People have said, oh, okay, it's kind of trained on like, quote unquote, woke ideology, and it provides this sort of woke response to a lot of things. I don't know whether that's actually true or not on the facts, but there's a sense that it has these embedded biases of the policies of the organization that trained it. So how can you kind of approach those two things, and what are developers doing? I think there's two things worth noting. One is that when you train these models, what you're really doing is you're creating this vastly complex mathematical object. When we talk about a thing like ChatGPT and it has billions and billions of parameters, what you're basically saying is it's trained on all this data, and it then has billions of different data points that determine the output that it's going to give to any prompt. That training process is kind of a black box. It's very difficult to actually understand what's going on inside that mathematical artifact. But this is where things get really interesting, because we're really at the cusp of a whole new field of science and engineering, really that's about the nature of intelligence itself. It's super interesting. So first of all, you can see these patterns of neural networks throughout nature. It happens in our brain, although the similarities of what actually happens inside a language model, what happens inside is not that similar to a brain, but superficially there's these neural networks that function like it. But you see it across nature. You see it in the mycelium that is the fungal networks that exist in a forest. Like, they have a lot of the same properties. You see it in protein signaling networks. You see it in all these things that happen throughout nature. And we don't really understand intelligence is what it comes down to. So we're still really at this really super interesting frontier that probably over the coming years, we're going to have something at the level of Darwin origin of the species or an Einstein, reevaluation of all of physics, where we kind of start to figure out what is the fundamental structure of what it even means to be intelligence, what is in intelligence. And that's super interesting. And the baby steps toward that is we're developing technologies called mechanistic interpretability, but it basically just means how do you explain what's going on inside these complicated models. You can actually look at individual quote-unquote neurons. It's not the same as a neuron in a human brain, but they're mathematical objects where you can now look inside and see, well, what happens if you change a particular neuron? So for example, if you use a trained model to do something like, am I going to give this person credit for a loan or not? Well, right now, with a simple model, you can tell someone exactly why you got this credit score in this report, and you missed a payment, in the last year, so we're going to deny your credit report. If you go to these more complicated AI models, right now you may not know why it turns you down. You just may know that it's really, really good at turning down people. But that doesn't work because of regulatory requirements. So you have to be able to explain why that happens. We're at the early stages of having these technologies that can start to explain it. But the even bigger thing is actually the idea of open source AI. So right now, when you go to ChatGPT, you're using a service on the internet. You go to a place with lots and lots of computers. It's gated through a particular service provider where they determine how they're going to do the reinforcement learning. They determine how to train it. They determine even what sources of data they're going to train it on. And they've done a tremendous job. I don't want to take anything away from ChatGPT. I literally use it every day, if not a dozen times a day. So I love what they've done. But in my view, these highly centralized things where you go to a service provider on the internet, that's a baby step towards a decentralized AI, meaning it actually runs on your device. So that's the most exciting field that we're going at. So to talk about bias, the only way to ultimately address bias is just to recognize the fact that we're never going to agree on what's quote-unquote fair because we're all different people and we're all going to have different subjective experiences of this world in terms of what our value systems are and what we think is important. So how do you do that? You train your own AI. You create your own AI agents that reflect your own value system, or you open it up to learn from other people that you respect, that you want to absorb into these AI models. So we have to put AI onto devices. AI is going to run on your phone someday. It already can run on your computer, and soon language models will even run on your phone, and that's because these devices are getting much more powerful and more optimized, and for many, many cases of applications, you're not going to go to services on the internet anymore. It's going to run off your own computer, and you'll train it yourself.
I didn't go
Long
on
answer.
It was a long answer, but it was a great answer. I have a simple question for you. Going back to the Turing test, which is to remind everyone, can you discern whether or not you're speaking to a computer or a human? And if you cannot discern as a human, you've kind of reached the level, according to Alan Turing, you've reached the level that computers are as smart as people. Would you say that ChatGPT passes the Turing test?
ChatGPT generally doesn't pass the Turing test, but we have passed the Turing test with other AI. But the more important question is whether that's the right test. So Turing was a brilliant guy, did amazing. I mean, he originally was part of the war effort in World War II to break the Enigma machine and made hugely valuable contributions to computer science. And one of it was speculating on what would happen with AI. The problem with this test is there's a couple of problems with the test. One is that it's basically a deception game. Can a computer trick someone into thinking that it's the human instead of a computer? And there's just all these kind of silly hacks that get you there, like an AI that just starts putting gobbledygook and typing really bad and says it's only 5 years old using the computer, passes the Turing test because people can't figure out that it's lying. Okay, so if that was the subjective test, it's just not a great test. But here's the bigger thing, and it goes back to the what I was bringing up earlier, which is like we're trying to figure out what is intelligence. So there's been theories of what intelligence is, what is creativity. Some people have thought that language would be the thing that really makes humans different because it's the thing that's different from animals and it's what's special about us, and we can create writing, and that's going to be the thing that humans are just great at. So if you can replicate that, you kind of do what a human does. Well, I think the language models actually show us in some interesting ways that language may not be as complicated as we thought it was, because these models of training, they're not really hard programs. In some cases, they're 10, 20,000 lines of code. By the way, the human brain, like everything about our brain is like 20,000 genes. It's some very trivial number of tens of thousands of genes in our genome. So there's some base code there that codes for everything it is that's intelligent in humans, that actually you can distill it down to some fairly simplistic properties. And the net of it is that maybe language wasn't the thing that Turing should have thought about. So you could ask other questions, well, what should it be? And I'll say, I don't know what it should be. Maybe it's, could an AI come up with the theory of relativity? Would that be a good test? Who thinks that an AI could look at pure data and come up with the theory of relativity? They did it last year, and an AI figured out about 100 of the most famous equations in physics history just by looking at data. Now, the hard part of it is it's hard to brute force, so you had to get really smart about pathing through the solution sets so that you only focus on the things that can kind of work and exclude a lot of things that are impossible. And if you do that, it turns out AI is very good at reverse engineering its way into Maxwell's equations and relativity and all kinds of super complicated things, and hence will now be able to help us discover things that we don't know about today. So we don't know what intelligence is the bottom line. But the Turing test, it turned out, was too easy.
We definitely want to take questions from the audience. I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to throw it out to you all. My one more question is, people are scared about their profession, their majors in college. Are they going down the right path? Will their job be automated? What will they do? It's not the first time in history, of course, that we've seen something like this happen, but it seems very like the widest set of potential disruption. What is your advice to people who are worried about this? And where do you think we go from here? What are the right paths to pursue?
We're certainly at the forefront of a time when there's going to be enormous change. So when I got involved in technology, it was at the dawn of kind of Internet 1.0, and what I believed at the time of the Internet was that it was going to change every aspect of our society. That's what I thought 25, 30 years ago, and I think I was right? So, but I think the impact of artificial intelligence will be exponentially greater even than that was. So what would the comps be? Would it have been harnessing electricity? Would it be the creation of fire? It's going to be something more at that level. When we invented fire, we went from organisms that had to spend 18 hours a day grazing for food to being hyper efficient and gave us time to do all kinds of other stuff. So that's kind of what AI is going to do. It's going to add enormous value to all of our time. It's going to multiply the value of your time for any piece of time in the day. It'll help you make better decisions. It'll increase your well-being. But is it going to change jobs? No one can tell you what the jobs are and how they're going to change yet, because this is an emergent property. I mean, certainly entire jobs are going to be eliminated. Jobs that deal with words, other than a very small percentage of them, are probably going to be very heavily automated by artificial intelligence. Customer support jobs, I can't wait because I don't get good customer support from existing systems. Sometimes ChatGPT gives me better customer support than the company itself. So these technologies will rapidly replace that, but I'd also look to what does the future mean? So, I've spent a lot of my life making games and virtual worlds and online services. When we talk about the value of experience, that's really the convergence of a lot of this. Who has watched Star Trek? Star Trek The Next Generation? Okay, good. You remember the holodeck? The holodeck is what we're building. So it's not just going to be through language or a few images. Soon it's going to be entirely immersive experiences where you go online and can simulate any reality that you want. I'm not aware of any physics where it's going to give you force feedback like in Star Trek, but pretty much everything other than that, the ability to go into a virtual space and say what you want it to manifest in that space will have vast applications for education, for science, for engineering, for art. It's going to open up whole new domains. So I don't know what the job is to tell someone in college right now, but I think the two things I take to heart is because of the rapidly accelerating rate of change that we're up against, you have to have a lifelong learning attitude. I mean, listen, I'm a college dropout, so I've learned through my whole life how to do stuff. And I'm a lifelong learner. So I think that skill, the ability to continue to absorb and change your skill set over time, that's what's going to be really important. And certainly artificial intelligence is going to affect every conceivable field. So I would be networking and socializing and talking to everybody who's applying technology in interesting ways and learning from them and then figuring out how you can innovate.
Great answer. So I'm safe as the group head of innovation, is what you're saying. What questions do we have in the audience? Does anybody have any burning questions they want John or I to answer? Yes.
Yeah, I want to delve more into the intelligence. Like, I liked your example that you gave at the beginning when you said you walk out the door and, oh, it looks a little cloudy, a little misty. I should go back inside and grab an umbrella. And you explained how you can teach the computer, these are sunny days, these are cloudy days. But when do you teach the computer how to go inside and grab the umbrella?
That's a John question.
I mean, you can tell, you can say
You're asking a really complicated problem, but that's probably a whole other category of AI.
I mean, that's where I see the human intelligence is. It's like, my dad used to say he doesn't have the sense to come in and out of the rain. I mean, a computer wouldn't. The computer would say, oh, it's going to be raining. I'm going to go to the store anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The question is, how does the computer figure out that now what? Like, I know the situation in front of me, but now what? Now what do I do with it? Do you feel artificial intelligence is already there?
I mean, you can go to ChatGPT and ask it what it would do in certain situations, and it's probably going to give you a pretty good response most of the time.
Give responses of what people have already done. Like the other example you gave, the menu plan. No offense, but you probably could have Googled that, not Googled it, but you could have looked up YouTube nutritionists and they'd have said, here's my 7-day meal plan.
Yeah, it would have taken me a lot longer maybe to piece together all of those things.
No, but I'm sure there's somebody out there that has one.
For sure, yeah.
It doesn't just give you, that's a little bit of a misconception though. It doesn't just repeat things that it's seen before. It learns from patterns. And there's a lot of emergent content that happens within a language model. So there's sort of a meme around AI being a quote unquote stochastic parrot. And what that means is that it just learns statistically, meaning it just sort of gives you this statistical average of what it's observed before. And there is some truth in how it works mathematically. But if you look at what it produces, it also expresses what we call emergent properties, which means that from kind of simple systems and simple rules, it can lead to fairly complex and unexpected results. So I just wanted to lay that out there. But there is a whole other domain of AI, which is kind of outside of the realm of a ChatGPT language model. And the head of AI for Facebook Meta is Jan LeCun. He's a real advocate of saying that language models are cool, they have good applications, but it's kind of a dead end from an intelligence standpoint. You have to create AI that actually creates what are called world models, where it looks at the world and it deduces sort of what are the rules about that world, and then it takes those rules and it can apply them within novel situations. We don't really have an AI that does that. We do it through language right now and language associations and language patterns, but the language models themselves don't, quote unquote, understand anything. They don't generally have a lot of rules that drive the structure of reality beneath them, although there have been some interesting exceptions to that. There have been language models that have been trained on board games, for example, like Othello. There's a relatively recent paper that built something called Othello GPT. Didn't know about anything about Othello when they started trained it, and then they looked into the neural network, and it was kind of creating the equivalent of the Othello board inside the memory space of the language model. So a very simple, quote unquote, world model, kind of capture the rules of reality. But as a general rule, that doesn't happen in language models. It's about correlations and maybe some emergent properties. But that's a whole other domain of AI that isn't out yet, but companies are working on. Well, you teach it with a reward function that says you want to be warm and dry, so optimize your response based on that parameter. So first of all, I think the mental model of the way to think about something like ChatGPT or Claude or Bard or any of these products in the current state is they're kind of like a smart intern, but not an authoritative source of knowledge. So I would give it a task, listen to the feedback, and then if it's important for the data to be accurate and complete, you would have to compare that to other data sources and conclude for yourself whether it's accurate. Where it can be really helpful is maybe setting you down some paths that you hadn't considered about a particular area of research. It could generate a bunch of examples for you. It might integrate certain sets of information in unique and novel ways, but it's still going to be up to you to use that to maybe inspire your own creativity in terms of how you approach that. Now, there are new types of AI coming. They're not in ChatGPT right now, but that do things like integrate other databases of vetted data alongside of the information that you've got there. So for example, if you're going to build a financial application that needs to know accurately like the stock price of every company on a particular date, for example, you would want to check that in a database that has that information verified, not just go by what was in ChatGPT, but there's ways to program and kind of merge those data sets together. And this is a very quickly moving forward field, and people are doing that kind of work right now. Yeah, the AI will get better and better, right? Like there's already, for example, in ChatGPT, a plugin architecture that lets it go and pull in other programs, for example, that could help inform exactly what it needs to do. But again, the field is moving very rapidly. Anything we said in this entire discussion about AI right now, these things may not be as relevant in even a month or two. Like the field is moving that fast. There could be a whole new version of ChatGPT, and also the technologies keep leapfrogging each other. Just a few weeks ago, my company built a game in one day with the assistance of AI, and we didn't use ChatGPT. We used another technology called Claude, which is from a company called Anthropic, which I think it was 2 weeks ago, Amazon then invested $4 billion into them. So massive amounts of capital, lots of development. The smartest people in the world are working on this stuff. So, but yes, for right now, and until you start personally seeing otherwise, I would definitely make sure that anything you use for research purposes or something like really important, like, if you used it for medical information, for example, I'd make sure it's giving you accurate information. Though that said, there was an interesting story a few weeks back about someone who their child was suffering from some kind of disease. They went to 20 doctors or something. Nobody could figure it out until she finally went to ChatGPT with all the things that her child was experiencing, diagnosed the child, recommended the kind of doctor she needed. She went to that doctor. He verified it. So there's your verification. She didn't just act on it. She took that information to the doctor recommended by ChatGPT. He did the tests to verify it, and in fact, it was the thing ChatGPT predicted.
That's a good closing question, I must say. I am I'm optimistic. I am not optimistic that we will rid the machine of bias. I am optimistic that the women that are working with AI and the women in the professions that they're in will actually be more open to using artificial intelligence because we are more collaborative by nature. We're more open to learning new things and adopting new things. And I think my gut is telling me that AI is going to power women to be more successful than it is going to power men. And I actually think that over time, AI is the great equalizer for the gender gap.
Thank you.
So let's round of applause. We're going to move on to the next topic, and then after we finish, we're going to have coffee, tea, desserts out front, and hopefully you guys can stay and people can ask some more questions. I know there are plenty more out there. We can get to them all. So I learned a ton today. I knew a bit of your presentation. John was a wild card. I'm like, I've known him for years. Let's see how he does, right?
All right, that's the right slide. By the way, you can turn the lights off. I'm usually better with the lights off than the lights on. All right, well, good evening, everyone. I would say two things. I will not offer any information on how to close the gender gap. I'm not going to end humanity nor solve disease. So this is going to be much lighter. We're just going to talk about the financial markets and figure out if we can see how to make money. All right. So maybe we'll start with how do we use AI? No, I'm just kidding. So as we think about capital markets, right? So we're going to skip some of the what have we, where are we, or what's happened in markets year to date. I think we ran out of time for that. And we'll just start talking about where do we think the world's going and some of the more interesting themes that are playing in capital markets today. So these are the slides we're going to skip. I think we can largely say, hey, guess what? Markets are up. They've taken a bit of a step back. Two interesting things are really happening just to level set on what's going on in the world today from a capital markets perspective. The first is in fixed income. Fixed income has been boring for 25 years. It's been a story that no one's wanted to talk about. We've really been, in an era of decreasing interest rates since Volcker, broke the back of inflation in the late 1970s and 80s. Now, fixed income is interesting again. And the left chart, I don't know if anyone can see this, and if you can't, I promise I'll describe it. The left chart here is effectively what you can earn in treasuries and even how much it's changed over the last 3 months. Now, if we were to rewind the clock to 2021 and you'd ask me what can you earn in treasuries, I would tell you effectively nothing. Especially after inflation, you're going to earn 0. Today, you're earning a lot more in fixed income, and for investors, right, for us that want to earn with our money, that is very meaningful. So we're actually in it's not a new era, but it's one we haven't experienced in a while, in which in order to make a reasonable rate of return in the markets, you don't have to take on a ton of risk. In an era in which fixed income returns would get you 1 or maybe 2%, 3% perhaps, you really had to look to equity markets, international markets, private equity. And by the way, those are all still very viable areas of the market to generate return, but we're not being forced into those areas of market anymore. So that's something new, and that's new today. But the fixed income market isn't necessarily agreeing even with itself. So the left side of this chart is saying, that's interest rates. It's saying, hey, something's going on here. I don't know, is there a recession out there? I'm not sure. The right side of this is what's called corporate bonds. So bonds of companies, not the US government. And they're very sanguine. They're saying, hey, everything looks good. Actually, things look better than good. We have really no primary concerns. So the fixed income market, just to bring you up to speed, is one of kind of a tale of two halves. Half of it is telling us, hey, there's something amiss here. We're not quite sure. The other half is saying, you know what? Don't worry about anything. Everything's going to be just fine. Now, as we turn to maybe equity markets, actually, this is where we dovetail very well into AI. What has won year to date in equity markets? Well, if anything's attached to it that has AI, so some of the names we saw, Microsoft, NVIDIA, you can call that kind of the picks and shovels of AI. They make the stuff that helps the data that then creates the AI that then gets into ChatGPT. That stock is up over 200%. Well, if you look, the S&P is up quite a bit this year, but there's a handful of those securities that have done very well. They've been dubbed the Magnificent Seven. I don't know who comes up with these names. It was FANG, then FANG-M, the Magnificent Seven. So if we look at the left side of the chart here, year to date, that bar, S&P, this is as of September 30th. We're a little lower than that now. S&P up 13%. That's just the S&P that you read in the Wall Street Journal every day. Now, if you look at the equal weighted S&P, that's taking all, ironically, there's 506 stocks in the S&P 500, not 500. If you take all of them and have an equal weight in all of them, actually the S&P is up a little over, just under 2%. It's because those 7 stocks have accounted for so much return in the S&P 500. That's why they are the Magnificent Seven. And what that has created is it's created a pretty interesting disparity in the market. And if you look in the upper right here, you can see the Magnificent Seven in a nerdy investment way. We break the world into large companies or small companies, value companies, so those that statistically look inexpensive, and growth companies, those that grow very quickly. The Magnificent Seven are all on the upper right. They are big, large US companies that are growing very quickly, and they've been very successful. Well, the graph you're looking at, this heat map, is saying, well, just compared to history, not that history is always instructive, but just compared to history, are these things expensive or inexpensive? And on the upper right, you can see the kind of Magnificent Seven or large cap growth US. That's trading at about a 30% premium to its 20-year averages. And by the way, that 20 years has 15 years of it in which large cap growth was the belle of the ball, right? Since the GFC, large cap growth has done very well. So those stocks are fairly expensive. Doesn't mean there's going to be a problem with them. It's just recognizing the facts. So let's look at the bookend here. Small value. So small companies in the United States and those that appear to be inexpensive, those are trading at a 16% discount relative to their history. So the market is presenting us with an interesting kind of set of opportunities, and it's one that we have to navigate carefully. So as we came into 2023, there were really 3 themes that we were talking about that would really be driving prices. So these 3 were persistent volatility, moderating inflation. I want to make sure I got them in the right order. Moderating inflation and a bear market bottom. Now, if we just called time on markets for 2023 now, persistent volatility, I certainly think we've had a lot of that. Moderating inflation, we went from 9% inflation down to, we actually had an inflation print today of 3%, 3 and change. So that, going from 9 to 3, I would call that moderating. And then a bear market bottom. Since October 14th of last year, the S&P has risen. Now, we recognize the S&P fell about 3% last quarter and has dipped a little bit recently. But nonetheless, prices have been rising. And so, one of the things as we talk about the Magnificent Seven, and I swear I'm not asking you to read these numbers, I'll just give you a big, letters on what this chart actually means. When we talk about the Magnificent Seven, one of the concerns as we think about volatility, this notion of volatility, is that if you have a few things that are driving most of the success in markets, if you just get one of those things not working very well, it's like your star player. If your star player is out, it's harder for your team to win. Well, if your 2 top star players are out, wow, you guys are really in trouble. And you get the story, right? So historically, as we think about periods of very narrow leadership in markets like FANG-M and MAG-7, those tend to lead towards periods of higher volatility. Now, volatility in and of itself isn't evil, right? Volatility is the cousin of opportunity, right? Without volatility in markets, we couldn't make money. It would just kind of bump along and everyone would make a little bit, no one would make a lot. But we should plan for that volatility. We should build a portfolio that's resilient and robust enough to be able to weather that volatility. Right, these are backwards. Okay. So now we turn into the Fed. The Fed has been the topic of conversation really all through 2022, largely into 2023. We would probably argue the conversation on the Fed at this point is a little overdone. We should turn our direction away from the Fed. But I'm anticipating some would ask about it, so we'll give you some context. The slide is entitled, you can see in the upper left, "The end is near." That is not a quip on AI, it is a quip on the Fed. We think the Fed has really played its hand, right? It has primarily stepped into markets in 2022 looking to tame inflation. Inflation went from 9% on an annual basis down to 3 and change. Their stated goal is 2, which we can talk about later. I think that's somewhat of a false narrative on 2%. The Fed's not going to break the economy just to go from 3 to 2. So that's a false target. But nonetheless, throughout history, anytime that we've seen the federal funds rate, so the federal funds rate today is 5.25%, above the rate of inflation for at least a year, then that has been the terminal rate for the Fed. And by the way, the Fed does not have a crystal ball somewhere. They are guessing about data just like we are. In 2022, right before they raised 50 basis points, 6 days before they raised 50 basis points for the first time since Greenspan, they said, we are not raising 50 basis points. And then 6 days later, they raised 0.5%. And then actually at the next meeting, they raised 0.75%, right? So the Fed is trying to read tea leaves as well. But we do think with where we are today with interest rates, if we're not at the end, we're pretty close to it. The Fed might raise another 0.25 point, but we're not going from 5 to 10. Like we went from 0 to 5 in 2022. That was very painful. Now, what has also happened is on the right. I don't know how much I want to explain this chart because it's a little busy, but basically the market didn't believe the Fed. Starting out this year, the market said, great, I hear you, Fed. You said you're going to raise rates. We don't believe you. By 2024, so this shows a probability distribution by summer of 2024, what the market's best guess is of where interest rates are going to land. And on the left side of the chart, it shows you the probability distribution at the end of last year was the Fed was saying, we're going to raise rates, we're going to stay higher for longer, and the market said, BS. Now the market actually believes the Fed, and this notion of higher for longer has permeated into prices. And you've seen that in fixed income this year with interest rates moving up quite a bit. Now, maybe. Trying. Got it. So this brings us back to the notion, because we get this question all the time. Well, the Fed's been raising interest rates. And now I can look at my money market portfolio. God forbid, it's not your checking account, it's your money market. And you can say, cash is yielding 5. Why would I own anything other than cash? If I can get 5 in cash, why shouldn't I just stay in cash? Especially if bonds, 3-year, 5-year, 7-year bonds, are earning less than cash. Well, if you start to paint the narrative of which I just described, inflation has come down materially. And that was the Fed's remit, to stop inflation. So the Fed is now at its peak Fed rate. Let's just call it where we are today. Maybe it's a little bit higher, but we'll just call it where it is today. Now, if you look back historically, from the point that the Fed stops raising rates, and you fast forward just 1 year, the green bars here are the Barclays aggregate. It's the most common fixed income index. It's the S&P 500 of fixed income. And the bars on the left are cash. Well, what happened? I thought cash was yielding more than bonds. Well, it's important to know that cash is going to give you a current yield and it resets all the time. And as the Fed hits its peak rate, what often happens at peaks? You start to fall. Cash rates reset immediately, and they start to fall with that. Whereas bonds often can be lifted by prices as interest rates are falling. We learned this hard way in 2022. As interest rates rise, bond prices go down. Well, if interest rates fall, bond prices can go up. And so history, look, it never repeats itself, but sometimes it rhymes, is instructive to us into say, hey, I realize cash is really tempting today, but cash might not be the most efficient way to allocate your assets. And there's probably better ways to build a more resilient portfolio, especially in, oh, man, there it goes. Oh. Okay, well, there we go. Especially in light of where fixed income is today. So let me explain this one, because this one's kind of important. The light blue line is the yield of the Barclays Ag. Think of it as like the coupon. In general, you can think about that as your long rate of return. And in 2020, as I was mentioning, over here, fixed income is really giving you almost nothing, especially after inflation. Well, moonshot, the Fed's trying to fix inflation, and so fixed income rates go up a lot. Now, the dark blue line is what's called the earnings yield of the S&P 500. And that's the equivalent of, call it the yield within equity. So for the first time since the early 2000s, effectively the yield you can get in fixed income relative to the earnings yield you can get in the equity markets are basically the same. And it means the gap that has been there for 2 decades or a decade and a half of needing to take on more risk in equity markets to have a positive rate of return over fixed income has shrunk, and it's shrunk massively. Now, again, that does not mean that equities don't play a role in our portfolio. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it does mean that fixed income, unlike what it has been for a number of years under a zero rate interest policy, is far more attractive. Now, this is where we also get a lot of questions. So what about the recession? Ending 2022, coming into 2023, I think if you read any, the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg or CNBC, every prognosticator out there was saying, well, the recession is coming. It might be March 15th or March 18th or April 1st, but it's a certainty. If you're not humble with markets, markets will humble you. That's a quote that we often use in our business, and it's because there's always a lot of uncertainty. The future has always been uncertain, and it remains that way today. So this idea of a rolling recession has been a big part of the narrative in 2023. It's always right around the corner, but it's never showed up. Well, if we're looking, and recession wasn't part of our base case in the construction of your portfolios coming into 2023. Now, if we're looking to say, where are the areas of the market where recession could be of largest concern, right? It's not the Fed tips us into recession. Actually, it feels like they've been fairly prudent with interest rates. It's more consumers. So what is the current state of the US consumer? If you rewind the clock and you look at this kind of EKG looking chart, this is savings rates for US consumers. It's tracked by the San Francisco Fed. Now, the precise how much people have in bank accounts is not an easy number to actually get, but the first spike here is during COVID, right? We had a manufactured recession. We said, everybody stay home. But in order to stave off depression, we sent a lot of money. We sent a lot of checks. We spent a lot of money. And so savings balances went way up. Then you saw during shelter in place, that continued to dip down. The second EKG is more stimulus. Now we're kind of below that trend line, right? So consumers have been spending what they were given. You can also see this in a number of different ways. Again, this data is not precise. This is a chart from JP Morgan. I love it so much because JP Morgan can't even agree with itself. So they just put all of it on one chart. So they have their econ department, their investment bank, and their private bank. Now, here's the thing. Again, we don't need precision here. We just need direction. All of these things are telling us, hey, on a net basis, consumers are a little bit more stretched today than they were before. And that comes in a lot of different ways. Inflation is a real phenomenon. Wages have not stayed with inflation. I think we feel that. We feel that whether it's at the gas pump or milk. The cost to purchase a house today is way more expensive than it was just a few years ago. If you were to buy a car today, it's more expensive, right? So consumers have been spending through some of this pent-up stimulus. And let's remember, in the United States, global domestic product, GDP, 70% of that is consumption. So consumers are really, really important to the economy. Now, does this mean that we're going into an immediate recession? No. But we would also say you should embrace the inevitable, right? Recessions are a normal part of economic expansion and contraction. They are inevitable. They happen on average since 1950 about every 6 years. So this idea that it's just around the corner, but we're going to see it before it gets here and then avoid it somehow and then get... That is a false narrative, right? We don't think we meaning people who invest, if they tell you they can time the market, especially recessions, they're either lying to you or they're lying to themselves. The other thing is about timing a recession is actually timing the wrong factor. Markets and recession, or markets and economies are related, but they're more cousins than they are twins. And so markets tend to lead recessions. And so even if you perfectly time the recession, you would mistime the market. So what should we do about this idea of this recession that's always right around the corner? Is we should just embrace the inevitability that, yes, a recession is always coming. When it's not a recession today, eventually a recession will occur, but we should build portfolios with the idea in mind that market timing or try to time a recession is such an expensive thing if you get it wrong. So this is a chart. You may have seen it before. It's an oldie but a goodie. And this looks at the S&P 500 total return. So if you were to invest over 10,000 trading days, the total left bar, that's your total return. If you were to be out of the market for just the 5 best days over a 10,000 day period, so since the 1980s, you just put money in the S&P 500 and forgot about it, you would have reduced your total return by 43%. That is a staggering figure. So if you time the market, Lord knows you better be right, because if you're wrong, then you miss out on a lot. And guess what? The best days in the market also happen at the times when things feel the worst, right? Some of the best days in the market were right around March 2009. That sounds crazy, right? Because the world was falling apart and Chicken Little and AIG was about to go under. Those were some of the best times in the market. By the way, they were also the worst. But by missing some of those days and not staying invested, the cost is very high. Oh, so that brings us to this idea, and maybe this can spark some questions and get to fireside chat. But all of this, this recession is looming. What do we do next, right? Recently, we've kind of been calling this the wall of worry, right? There's plenty to worry about, whether it's AI is going to take over the world and we'll no longer have jobs. It could be the horrible events that happened over the weekend, U.S.-China relations. Hey, remember that banking crisis we had in March? It was kind of a, whoops, there goes a couple of banks, right? All of those things, one, worry is not a new trick for the human species, right? We've had these issues in the past, and guess what? We have persisted. But they feel particularly acute today. So when we're building portfolios, right, we just walk through the math. It's way too costly to try to time markets, and no one can really get it right and get it right consistently. What tools do we have at our disposal? We talked about fixed income and the role it can play. That is new. That's a new trick for fixed income it hasn't had in 15 years. But maybe, Mike, I know, I don't have my watch on me. I know we ran over the last presentation and we want to reserve time for questions. So I'll even leave this slide up as a, as a point of potential questions so we can talk about the wall of worry. But on a net basis, what do we really want to do with all of this? Right? We want to build a thoughtfully diversified portfolio, one that's designed to brace the inevitable recession, the inevitable horrible humanitarian events that happened over the weekend, the inevitable bank failure that will happen. Those things are part and parcel to the world in which we live. And so we have to invest with those as given criteria to build that resiliency so that we can weather and succeed through them. So maybe we'll pause there and we can go straight to either your questions or anyone else's.
Can you talk a little bit about when you're creating a portfolio, there's an opportunity set that's huge, right? All kinds of vehicles all over the world, all kinds of asset classes, and then different ways to make them investable. Without getting too granular, because I know it can get granular, what's the big picture? How do you go about doing that for different mixes of assets along the way?
Do you mean specifically for endowments or just in general?
No,
how do we narrow the world down
Yeah.
to something investable? One of the things I worked for a number of money center banks for a period of time in New York. And of course, you'd be not surprised at all. The products that they had to sell were the ones they wanted in your portfolios, right? So they would kind of narrow the world for you and say, hey, I know you can invest in anything, but we happen to have this over here, and you should have more of that in your portfolio. We don't have that conflict. So to your point, it's the world is our oyster, but how do we actually start to narrow down? I can invest in anything, but how do I take that from anything to 10 things? So we have an entire team that's dedicated to 2 lines of research. The first is just on a global basis, searching for asset classes that we want to own. So I was talking about fixed income today. We have dedicated individuals that are parsing through the fixed income market saying, what is it about these markets that make them interesting today, that make them beneficial for you? And importantly, this is the key word, on a go-forward basis, right? We can't buy yesterday's return. We can only build a portfolio that puts us in a highly probable position for tomorrow's, hopefully successful returns. So we have a team that's dedicated at the biggest, broadest level. So which kind of parts of the market do we want to own? Then we have a separate body of research that says once in this analogy, we have the frame of the house, right? So we know how much we want to own in equity and fixed income. What type of equity do we want to own, US or international? What type of fixed income do we want to own? So that's a framing of the portfolio. Then we have to populate it, right? So I guess in that analogy, it would be putting up the drywall and the furniture. Those individuals are responsible to then say, okay, how do we build an efficient portfolio? What is it? Do we use active or passive? What vehicles do we use? Do we use an ETF or a mutual fund or a separate account? And it's relative to what your objective is. With an endowment, actually, they're a lot simpler than we are as investors because they don't pay taxes, right? So it's just after fee. But for us, it's after fee, after tax, right? Because you can't eat pre-tax, you got to eat post-tax. So we build all of that to stack probabilities in our favor, right? So we try to build the frame of the house that has the highest probability of winning in the future, and then use active and passive, use the right vehicles, and that helps us narrow the world down to what is, I would call a thoughtfully diverse portfolio, right? Where you have exposure across the globe in what we think are the right spots, but you don't own everything, right? There's kind of diversification. If you own just a little bit of everything, you might as well own nothing, right? You get an average of everything. So there's a tipping principle of kind of diversifying too much.
Thank you. Let's talk recession, because I know everywhere I go, at least in my world, people are talking about recessions. This is the most long-awaited recession, I think, in the history of the world. Right? For several years, we've been talking about recession. And to your point, earlier in the year, nothing looked good. Right? There was a banking crisis. Everyone was calling for a recession in Q1, and so on and so forth. So I'd like to think we don't have market timers in this room, but if we did, and you left the market, you missed a wonderful first half of the year, right? So do you do anything in adjusting your portfolios when you assign a higher probability of recession?
So this is kind of the great principle of like diversification, right? How do you build a portfolio? So if you know nothing, we have no information about what the future holds whatsoever, and there's 10 things we could invest in, we should just own 10% of each, right? We just simply spread our assets because we have zero information about the future. Now, never do we know perfectly what the future will hold, because if you know perfectly what the future would hold, own one thing and one thing only, and own only that, right? Like that is the perfect portfolio. Clearly, reality lives somewhere in the middle. As we look at context, you can almost call it tone of markets. So we talked about a weakening consumer. On the back of that consumer, you can add in a lot of things, right? So it costs more to buy a house, it costs more to buy a car. Student loan programs are coming back in for the first time since COVID. That just happened last month. So those interest and debt payments are going to have to happen. So you're shaping kind of what the consumer looks like. There are other factors that you can look at that are interesting but not perfectly predictive. So leading economic indicators. You've probably heard of the inverted yield curve, right? So as you start to stack these things together, it gives you a mosaic of where to lean. And so as the probability of recession rises, risk management is always important, right? But even more so as those probabilities rise, building that resiliency into portfolios is the thing that will ultimately win the day. The worst thing we can all do, right, is have a portfolio that we think is A, diversified, and B, appropriate to my risk target. And then guess what? The market falls, and then we go to cash in March of 2009, or actually March of 2020. I was born in March. I don't know why March seems to be the bottom. But we need to build a portfolio in anticipation of those moments, because those are the ones that truly destroy return. And so as we think about recession, is a recession possible? Yes. Is it probable? Maybe, right? We might have a recession in 2024. Does that mean I need to own all cash? Absolutely not, especially in the instance that you're wrong. And anyone that was sitting in this point in 2022 and was extremely confident about 2023 being a recession, they've missed out on a lot.
Okay. Let's go to the next step, the yield curve. Yield curve is basically for, you've got a 1 month treasury, 3 month treasury, 6 month treasury, and typically as you go out longer, the rates go up. And conventional wisdom says when that curve inverts and short rates are higher than long rates, that a recession is coming. Right? That's conventional wisdom, I guess, or it's coming at some point. Or we can talk more about that. When this thing normalizes, the thought process is the short end of the curve comes down and the long end doesn't change much. Recently, the long end of the curve has risen. Short end's been pretty much stable. So thinking out loud, do you think that's confidence in the U.S. economy, or is it worrisome about where national debt and the like?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take each of those. The inversion of the yield curve is kind of the indicator. So look, if markets were as simple as the yield curve inverts, we go into recession, go to cash, like none of us would have a job. So it is a bit of a farmer's almanac indicator, right? There's no precision to it. Now, interestingly enough, so why does an inverted yield curve potentially indicate recession? Well, one of the primary components is that the cost of banks to lend. So when we build a business, when we buy a house, when we buy a car, we often don't do that with cash. We do it with debt. Well, the way the banks work is they lend to you short, right? They take the money in your checking account and they give it to someone over a longer period of time. Well, if what they're paying you on the short end, they're paying you more than what they can lend at, then banks stop lending. And so it's hard to start a business. It's hard to hire people. It's hard to buy a house, and a recession occurs. Now, I don't know if anyone's looked at their checking account, but my checking account is not earning 5.25%. It's earning 1 basis point. So yes, we have an inverted yield curve, but it's not as indicative of what it's meant in past cycles that banks have to stop lending. Now, don't get me wrong, banks have their own problems, and we can talk about that if we want to. But I think the strength of the signal is probably different today than it has been in the past. So with that said, now the long end of the curve moving, not the short end of the curve, I think there's a lot of things you could potentially point to. The long end of the curve, I think there's a couple of technical factors today. One, China's had a really rough go of it. I mean, they've had COVID zero. They just exited last October. Their economy's been shrinking. They've got some political dissident and discourse. China is the largest U.S. holder of debt. They've had to be selling treasuries to fund stimulus in their country. So that's a technical factor. A big buyer is selling, and they owned a lot on the long end of the curve. The second factor also there is this notion of a recession, right? If you want to own, basically, if you think about the bet that's being made, if you own the 30-year bond, you're betting a recession is coming. If you own cash, you're betting that inflation is going to go up and the Fed is going to have to raise rates. Well, as I showed you in that chart, the market's starting to believe that the Fed is going to be higher for longer, and that this recession that's kind of waiting for Godot recession, always around the corner, it's a little too far out. So those that have made a bet on the 30-year saying recession is going to be here any minute, they're running out of space. They're kind of they're giving up on that bet, right? And so as they sell, the long end of the yield curve rises. So there's some technical factors there. And then the last, which you mentioned, is just U.S. deficits. It costs a lot to bail out the economy during COVID. It costs a lot through the GFC, not nearly the same amount as it cost through COVID. We've accumulated a lot of debt, and we've done so largely at really low interest rates. So it didn't make it all that punitive. Now interest rates are higher at the behest of the Fed, And so the cost of funding that debt is more expensive. That means that there's going to be more pressure on treasuries. So there's a little bit of nuance there.
Excellent. Not to go to Washington, because no one wants to talk about it, but with a lot of dysfunction taking place in Washington and spending bills having trouble getting secured and the debt limit being crashed up against all the time, and that may or may not be arcane, but we've been downgraded by 2 rating services now, one in 2011, one this summer, I believe, and a third one's rattling the saber to downgrade the U.S. How does that play out, and how does it play out in the markets in the near term, and then go a little longer term?
Politics in general are not all that instructive to economics. I think on the fringe, they are, policy can affect spending, and spending can affect the economy, and the economy can affect the markets, but it's usually on the edges, not in today's capital. I would say not just the discourse, but the dysfunction of the political system in which, think of it, if you ran a business and every 6 months you had to shut down the business because you had to fire the CEO or whatever it is, like that's a broken business. So we can go ahead and call that, is that democracy or is that broken? Interesting enough though, the reaction function of those things has been waning over time, right? It's kind of like the first time you see something, you've never seen it before, it's pretty scary. And then you learn about it, and then the next time it's like, that's not that scary. And then the next time. So whether that's a good thing or not, the markets are far less reactive to this notion of a shutdown in the federal government, a downgrade of U.S. Treasuries from, pick your rating agency of the day. It does beg the question, will the U.S. government or the dollar or the Treasury market kind of remain the reserve currency of the world? There's a lot of factors that go into that, but maybe instructive of the horrible events over the weekend. The fact that the U.S., which has the largest army or navy and military force in the world, moved the aircraft carrier, the strike group, the Gerald Ford, into the East Mediterranean. That as a show of force, right? That, as you think about treasuries and the role they play in the world, that's not going away anytime soon. So is government maybe broken in some ways? Yes. Is that going to be particularly instructive to outcomes in markets in the near-term future? Probably not.
Switching gears one more time. Talking about private markets, private equity, private debt, private real estate. There was a shine on them for a while. The shine seems to be coming off. Can you discuss those asset classes?
Yeah. So, I described an environment in which, in order to achieve return, you had to add more and more risk, because fixed income really gave you almost nothing. And so, as you extend risk, it's like you start at the bottom of low risk, and that's treasuries, and then you lend to companies, and then you start to get into less highly graded companies. Then you get into equity markets, right? So as you kind of go further and further out this curve, you're introducing more and more potential risk. To be compensated for that risk, you should demand a higher return, and that's how the general economic system works. Private markets are an example of that. Private markets, frankly, from a structural basis, do have some pretty material advantages to public markets. Let me just give you one, because I know we don't have a ton of time. In the globe, there's about 7,000 stocks that you can buy or sell at any given time. In the United States alone, there's about 250,000 businesses with earnings of 25 million or more. That is a huge opportunity set of businesses to potentially buy and succeed in owning, right? So just the opportunity set is that much larger. Now, in the environment that I was talking about, where fixed income is really not earning anything and you're forced to take more and more risk, well, now we're in a different world. Fixed income is actually earning something. And in 2022, I think a lot of investors looked at private equity and they're like, wait, the markets are down and fixed income's down, but my private equity portfolio, it's still, it's got the same price. That doesn't make sense. And there was this bit of an air of distrust. Well, that's more of an accounting issue than it is anything else. Now, if you look at private equity 6 months or a year later, private equity has done the same thing that public markets have done in 2022. They've fallen, they've retraced in price. There's some downside risk there. But just like anything else in investing, right? Volatility is the cousin of opportunity. That also creates more opportunity in private markets. So yes, I think the sheen has come off of private equity is this kind of, just because I own private equity, I outperform. That's a misnomer. And that was a mindset that was driven by, I can't earn anything in fixed income, so I got to take more risk, and people just extended that risk. But if you step back and you look at private equity as a whole, or private real estate or private debt, in certain circumstances, those markets can be great opportunities in the right instances to add a lot of value over time.
Okay, next topic, commercial real estate. It's been in the news. A whole bunch of debt. I think commercial real estate usually runs 7 or 10 years, and the debt, a bunch of debt's coming due over this next cycle. Banks are a little bit of a tight situation. What are your thoughts around that?
I feel like you're reading from the slide here. Do we have commercial real estate? We might have commercial.
I've got eyes in the back of my head.
Yeah, exactly. So commercial real estate, I feel like when we talk to people about commercial real estate, they're often conflating office and what happened during COVID with commercial real estate as a whole. Commercial real estate is a very big, broad investment group. It's almost $5 trillion in assets in total. When we're talking about office, which is what is usually like the next shoe to drop, right? COVID happened, no one went back to the office, there's a lot of debt out there, all these office buildings are in real trouble. So if we look at the almost $5 trillion in commercial real estate in the United States, in the public markets, office is 4% of that. And in the private markets, office is 25% of that. So first, we've already scaled the issue in a very different way. Because if you just say commercial real estate's in trouble, you've conflated two things, right? Like AI is powered on transistors, and you need servers to do all the cool stuff we just talked about. Data centers have gone through the roof. They're doing really, really well. That's commercial real estate, right? So first we need to focus what the issue is, and the issue is office. Now, office has some problems. COVID shifted the mindset. A lot of the investments we work with, they actually track what's called castle data. It's actually the key swipe. If you have a key fob to get into your office, this firm has that data, and they can see not just what is being rented, but how often people are going back into offices. It went from high 90s in office key swipes. COVID, went not to zero, but call it to 20%, right? So the workers that had to go in or considered essential. It's rebounded a lot, but it's rebounded to 50%. That's way below 90 and way below the prices that those buildings were sold at before. So the analogy that we would give is office today is kind of regional malls of the 2000s. 1990s, 1980s, we built malls everywhere. That was the thing. That was where kids hung out. That's where all retail was done. That's where you buy your shirt from Gap or fill in the other retailer. You got your Abercrombie stink as you walk by. They went through almost 2 decades of trying to figure out what's next for malls. Some of those got repurposed. Some of them got torn down. They turned into, like, my son goes to an indoor baseball facility in what used to be a mall, right? So people are inventive, and capitalism will reuse that. Now, office is going to go through its own renaissance because people are not going back in the same way. Now, there's always exceptions. The Sun Belt, Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina. I live in Illinois. No one's moving to Illinois. Everybody's moving out of Illinois, right? So people are moving to those areas, and guess what they need? They need more office. They need more commercial real estate. So there's always an exception. But in general, office has got some work to do, and it's going to take some time.
Questions we'll throw out to all of you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually one of the reasons I've been kind of on the soapbox about this idea of, should I just own cash or should I own bonds? Because when we build portfolios with the idea that financial crises happen. The S&P can fall by 50%. Like, these things, they don't happen always, but about every 10 years, the markets fall by 30% or more. And I'm just using the S&P as an example. So that's a known quantity. So when we build portfolios, we have to build that as a fact, right? It's not an if, but it's a when. So this idea of cash versus bonds, right? I just want to own cash. I can get a lot in my money market. Well, let's play that out from a portfolio construction, like in aggregate. What does that actually mean? We often say cash is good at protecting itself, but bonds protect the portfolio. So if we go through a downturn where the S&P falls by 15%, 20%, 30% or more, well, we've done the math at 15%, which is in historical terms, that's not a really deep, protracted fall, but it's meaningful. About 73% of the time, bonds outperform cash. But here's the important thing, not just the frequency, but it's the magnitude. So if we were to go into recession and the S&P were to fall 30%, well, guess what? The Fed's not going to sit there and say, well, I'm going to keep higher for longer, right? Because as unemployment rises, usually inflation follows because inflation falls because people are buying less because they don't have money in their bank account, right? So these things naturally occur. The Fed is going to start decreasing interest rates. And in those periods of time, fixed income doesn't just, if you started with, let's say, fixed income at a 5% yield and cash had a 5% yield. At the end of that year, where the S&P, in this theoretical example, the S&P falls by 30% and the Fed cuts rates and unemployment is higher, cash will have earned 5%, just like it said it would. It promised you it was going to earn 5, it gave you 5. Bonds are probably going to earn that plus 2, 3, 4, 5, 10%, right? So they're more potent in their ability to protect. And that's not always. 2022 is a great example of that, where interest rates were rising and bond prices fell. But as we think about in aggregate, I think your question is really astute, is that we have to build the portfolio in aggregate, knowing that those events take place and managing to them. Yeah, there's no version of I want my cake and what is it? Yes, exactly. Whatever that one was said. We can't expect a reasonable rate of return and take no risk. Like those don't coexist. And so we just have to understand what risk we're willing to take to find the rate of return we're willing to go after. That's where financial planning comes in. That's where estate and things that Michael was talking about before. All those things come into that full picture. But we can't just say, hey, I want a high returning portfolio with no risk. I wish. If you figure that out, give me a call. We'll go into business. It's a great question. It's the right question. So let's say a treasury, a 15-year treasury in this instance, you can get about just under 5% on a 15-year treasury. And let's say that is on the capital that you have that you've saved and accumulated and for retirement, 5% is enough. You don't have to earn anything more than that, and you're basically set for 5 years or 15 years. Well, what happens as let's say we get to the end of that 15-year window, those bond matures, you've kind of sat on that capital, and interest rates are now 1%. So now your reinvested capital that you went with that kind of one maturity and just locked it in for 15 years, now that earns 1/5 of what it earned before, and that's before we adjust for inflation, right? So as we think about the long horizon of the ability to spend, the ability to retire, outpace inflation, and that has nothing to do with like even passing on to an estate or growing that corpus on a real basis over time. Fixed income can play an important role in keeping those assets, but they rarely ever play a role in truly growing those assets. They're going to give you back what you put in plus a little bit more. And by taking just kind of that like singular risk, you're like, yep, I'm just going to own a 5-year bond, and then I'll roll the dice at the end of 5 years. Hopefully at the end of those 5 years, rates are higher, because if not, you're going to be in a pretty big pickle of trying to reinvest capital now at materially lower rates, and you're going to be really forced to own more equities to reach the same rate of return. So I get the theory, right, of just kind of like take the bookend of that, like let's just go all the way. The notion, right, the influence, the intuition of that is right, but I think taking that to its logical conclusion, doing only that, really introduces new risks and risks that are also punitive just in a different way. And that might make sense, right? So one of the things, Michael asked, right, how do we figure out how we take everything in the world that we can own, and then what do we want to own going forward? we're in a new interest rate environment that we haven't been in for 15 years. Let's say the 60-40 in 2021 was earning, the projected return was 6%. Well, now, with much less risk, I can get 4% in fixed income, let's call it. That can change the equation of, is the 60-40 right, or is the new 60-40 50-50? That all has to reconcile, obviously, with your financial plan and objectives and goals and what the market is presenting to us at the time that we're having those discussions. But it could indicate, hey, we should own a little bit more bonds here. Does it mean we own all bonds? No, because I think you introduce a brand new risk, in financial speak, it's reinvestment rate risk, right? Like, I have all of that and then it matures. What do I do now? So it should, on the margin, as the facts change, our opinions should change. Our portfolio should not be 60-40 forevermore. That's kind of just a sleep at the wheel. But should they go from 80-20 to 20-80? No. That is also not true. Yeah, it's, if you were, I guess I'll phrase it this way. Trying to build a portfolio over the next 3 months is kind of like chasing your tail. It's very, very hard to do. Rarely do you ever grab your tail. And when you do, it probably hurts. So building a long-term allocation on short-term data is not a prudent approach in our view. Now, when we talk about building portfolio construction, we literally look 10 years into the future. Valuation is an extremely predictive measure over a long period of time. It's almost somewhat indifferent over a short period of time. But that helps us build a broad framework of how we want to build a portfolio. Now, the thing is when you build a 10-year portfolio, though, you don't just bury it in the ground and dig it up in 10 years, right? So if you're looking long-term, rarely do things change over a 3-month period that are so material that you should change your portfolio in a meaningful way. Sometimes, like from December of 2019 to March of 2020, the world did change. And so that's a short period of time that's instructive to make a longer term view. But always, we find you're far more successful by being long-term greedy and thinking about kind of long-term opportunities rather than reacting to short-term data, because most of the time that leads you to false conclusions.
Unless there's any other very pressing question, we're going to call it a night, grab some either cocktails or some coffee or tea, maybe a piece of cake, and enjoy. Thank you very much for coming here tonight. We really enjoyed seeing you all.